Engineer Chairman, Sir Frederick Akwabwa, past presidents of the Ghana Institution of Engineers, members of council and members of the Ghana Institution of Engineers, representatives of professional bodies, members of government, if there are any here, members of the media, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start with a few acknowledgements. I'd like first of all to express my profound gratitude to God Almighty, who has sustained me throughout my life and brought me here today. Secondly, I wish to express my appreciation to my husband, CARLIEN Bou-CHEDID, who cannot be here today, and my daughter Zenobia for accommodating my many absences. Then my siblings, Engineer Frederick Engman and Engineer Charlotte Engman, and Ernest Engman, who's not here, but Frederick and Charlotte are here, who have supported me in diverse ways. I'd like to express my gratitude to all of them. I would further like to thank my chairman, Engineer Sir Frederick Akwabwa, who has come out of retirement to be here. If you want somebody who's calm and mature to be beside you, he's the man, and that's why he's here today. Then members of Wesley Girls High School class of 77. Thank you very much. You always have my back. I'd like to thank another special group of people, the women in engineering, or WINE for short. And for them, I'd like them to stand up and be acknowledged. Every female. It's a WINE thing. I'd like to also thank the Executive Committee of the Ghana Institution of Engineers, the entire council, and members of the GHIE for their backing. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Yate of NADGO, Professor Mrs. Entiamensa of CSIR, for making available to me information and pictures for this address. Professor Mrs. Entiamensa has always been a pillar of support, my chief backer, and she's here today. To the entire staff of the GHIE Secretariat, who have had sleepless nights to ensure the success of this function, I say a big thank you. I'm honored to serve this great institution as president, and I thank you all for electing me. This institution will be 50 years next year, and we'll be organizing several celebrations. But this institution has been established and sustained by many people. Its members have given selflessly of their time, and I like to thank them for it. And that's why it is an honor for me to serve. In my professional life, I've been concerned about the waste of our resources. I began working at AESL, and a lot of my work involved rehabilitation of houses. And a lot of the rehabilitation that we had to do was because the building hadn't been done right in the first place. Then I learned about earthquakes and began to understand that such buildings that were not properly put up in the first place could potentially cause a lot of trouble in the future if we had an earthquake. And so today, I want to concentrate your minds on the kind of risk that we face and what we need to do about it. As Ghana pursues its developmental agenda, it must recognize that it faces destabilizing risks, both natural and man-made, which have the potential to derail its progress and possibly even reverse the gains that it has made. These risks must be identified and fully understood so that actions can be taken to either prevent potential disasters or at least mitigate their effects. Disaster risk assessment provides a tool for understanding the risk posed by various hazards. It also provides a basis for rational decision making. Thus, the difficult decision as to whether to spend more money on making our infrastructure more resilient to a rare disastrous event or invest in additional infrastructure can be made. So understanding disaster risk further enables us to manage the risk in a manner that enables a speedy recovery, even when a major event occurs. So this briefly is what this address is about. Central to the development efforts of all countries lies a desire to improve the living standards of their peoples, and Ghana is no exception. In the quest to reduce poverty and ensure that their citizens enjoy peace and prosperity, the countries of the world have all signed up to a shared vision of sustainable development, which the World Commission on Environment and Development, that's the Brundtland Commission, defines as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I'll repeat that. It's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This vision is given expression in the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs for short. The SDGs encompass issues like ending hunger, providing quality education, clean water, sanitation, and industry, as well as innovation and infrastructure. And there are many more of these goals. The majority of the issues listed in the SDGs require significant investments in infrastructure. Such resources are typically in short supply in developing countries, and Ghana is no exception. A City FM online report of September 27, 2017, quotes the Public-Private Partnership Coordinator of the Ministry of Finance as saying that a study conducted in 2016 estimated that government would need $7.3 billion to tackle the country's infrastructure deficits, and that government did not have such financial resources to make up this deficit. This situation demands an extremely judicious allocation of our scarce resources. Disasters have the potential to set us back in our development by several years, if not several decades. And disasters can be caused by natural events like droughts, rainstorms, tidal waves, landslides, and earthquakes, or even incidents resulting from human actions like building collapse, industrial accidents, and so on. The probability of loss of life, injury, or destruction and damage from disaster in a given period is defined by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction as disaster risk. So when we talk about disaster risk, we are talking about the probability of loss of life, injury, or destruction and damage from a disaster within a given period. The events that have the potential to cause disasters are properly referred to as hazards. So the earthquake is your hazard. It's not the disaster itself. And I'll explain that further as we go along. The hazards are the things that have the potential to cause the disasters. They are not the disasters themselves. Disaster risk assessment is a tool that provides a rational basis for decision-making in the disaster mitigation process, and it is thus the first step in the process. Disaster risk assessment answers the question, how likely am I to suffer harmful consequences within a given time frame, and what will the magnitude of my losses be? So you can be asking, how likely am I to suffer harmful consequences from an earthquake within the next 50 years? And how big, what will the magnitude of my losses be? So disaster risk assessment answers that question. The answers to these questions help in making decisions on whether to spend more money, on protecting infrastructure systems to make them more resilient, or to spend that money in additional infrastructure for greater economic growth. To the extent that they have set these countries back considerably in their development. While many of the hazards cannot be prevented, the effects they have on our population and infrastructure can be mitigated with proper disaster risk management. Managing our disaster risk must therefore be elevated to the highest level in our infrastructure delivery process, else we risk creating an illusion of development that can be wiped out in a single catastrophic event. In this address, I aim to give you a better understanding of the issues that contribute to our disaster risk and tell you how we can assess our disaster risk and also propose the steps we can take to mitigate our disaster risk. The road from a developing country to a developed country. Ghana is currently a developing country. It is generally recognized that a well-developed infrastructure is essential for economic growth. Ghana currently has a deficit in infrastructure coupled with a growing population, which puts a greater demand on its infrastructure needs. Ghana is therefore making significant investments in areas like housing, schools, hospitals, industries, and other engineering infrastructure for agriculture, transportation, telecommunications, energy, water supply, and sanitation, and all these to facilitate its development efforts. These investments are being made by government and private sector individuals. A characteristic of such investments is that they require a long period to make adequate returns on investment, and they must operate efficiently within their lifespan if they are to contribute to our development agenda. Disasters pose a risk to such an infrastructure as they may destroy, significantly damage, or otherwise impair the ability to deliver the required returns on the significant investments that have been made. New investments will then be required to replace, repair, or otherwise restore the damaged infrastructure to their original levels of operation. Conventional wisdom would suggest that it would be more cost-effective to prevent damage in the first place than to suffer the damage and then replace or restore. When placed against the high demand for more infrastructure, the choice is less difficult. There are often pressing needs to reduce the initial investment in one infrastructure asset in order to make more resources available for another. A balance has to be drawn, therefore, between these competing needs. Understanding the risks involved in either course of action is essential for determining the best course of action. Disaster risk assessments which measure the probability and magnitude of losses occurring within a given period, can provide a rational basis for decision making. Now we come to understanding the disaster risk. Disaster risk can be considered as a combination of the severity and frequency of a hazard, the numbers of people and assets exposed to the hazard, and their vulnerability to damage. And vulnerability is defined as a measure of the degree of loss resulting from the occurrence of the hazard. This relationship can be expressed in the form of an equation. The equation is disaster risk is equal to hazard times exposure times vulnerability. And Engineer Chairman, this is the only equation I'm going to show today. A hazard only holds a theoretical potential to result in a disaster. A hazard must impact an area occupied by people and assets that are incapable of reducing the negative effects of that hazard before it can result in a disaster. And to give you an example, an extended period of drought can only lead to the disaster of famine if it occurs in a farming area that relies solely on rain-fed agriculture and in addition serves a community that is solely reliant on the crops produced in that area for its food. So you cannot, the hazard itself, by itself, cannot create a disaster unless you have exposure, and in the case of droughts, you have people there, and a vulnerability. They are only depending on the food from that area. They are only depending on the crops from that area for their food. So the same level of drought hazard will not lead to famine if it occurs where there are no farming activities. There will also be no famine in the farms that have access to adequate reserves of water for irrigation. Whilst reducing the severity and frequency of natural hazards may not be possible, we at least have the options of reducing the exposure of the people and assets to these hazards. And we also have the option of reducing their vulnerability and thus reducing the total disaster risk to negligible levels. With man-made hazards, on the other hand, it may additionally be possible to take steps to reduce the severity and frequency of occurrence of the hazard in the first place. In such cases, the solution will generally lie in gaining an understanding of the activities that bring the creation of the potential for destruction. So air pollution is a man-made hazard. Identifying all the factors that lead to air pollution can point to measures that reduce the level of air pollution and hence the risk from that hazard. Sometimes disasters occur out of a complex combination of hazards, and it is often necessary as a result to consider secondary effects and secondary hazards that may be triggered by the primary hazards in an assessment of risk. The rainfall that led to the flooding that took place on June 3rd, 2015, at the Kwame Nkrumah Circle was a natural event, but it triggered an industrial accident from a leaking oil tank at the petrol filling station, and this is what resulted in the horrifying disaster that we saw. Now we come to hazards in Ghana. Ghana is subject to natural as well as man-made hazards, and these have been identified by the National Disaster Management Organization, NADO, in their disaster management plan for Ghana. With the exception of hazards posed by pests diseases, and conflicts, all the hazards that they have listed in their management plan are relevant to engineering practice. The natural hazards can be classified as geophysical and hydrometeorological hazards. And so there you see the classification. Hydrometeorological hazards include floods, drought, storm surges, coastal erosion, and dam spills. And our geophysical hazards include earthquakes, liquefaction, landslides, and rockfalls. When it comes to our technological or man-made hazards, you have collapsing buildings, fires, industrial accidents, environmental degradation, and pollution. So these are the hazards relevant to engineering practice that have been identified by now. Dam spills are the controlled discharge of water from a dam. They are essentially, really, man-made hazards, and the spills are usually required when a dam reservoir is filled to capacity and risks being overtopped, that is, risk having the water overflow from the dam. So allowing a dam to be overtopped risks damage to the dam and possibly a great disaster of flooding. And we have actually experienced that kind of thing in Ghana before. In the siting of dams, it is recognized that dam spills will occasionally be required and that areas downstream will be flooded. Unfortunately, in Ghana, we have situations in which development still takes place within such areas, and these communities are repeatedly flooded anytime there is a spill. The key to mitigating the effects of this hazard lies in preventing development in these areas in the first place, or at least ensuring that managers of the dams provide sufficient notice so that residents can take appropriate action. Tidal waves. A tidal wave is a shallow water wave caused by gravitational interactions between the sun, moon, and earth. These tidal waves come ashore from time to time, and they sweep away people and property. And we had an experience this year, June 11th, 2017. This is the effect we had from that tidal wave that happened on June 11th. Communities along the coast were all flooded, and many of them were fishing communities, and they lost their nets and boats. They were all destroyed. And of course, the houses that were close by were also swept away. So this is not the only incident of tidal waves that we've had in Ghana. This is just the most recent. Ways of mitigating the effects of the waves include avoiding settlements to the shoreline, providing a bioshield, such as mangroves, constructing sea defense walls and breakwaters, and providing early warning systems. Now we come to flooding from rainfall. The factors that lead to flooding from rainfall include the intensity and duration of the rainfall, the surface condition of the ground, and the topography. The National Disaster Management Organization, NADRO, in collaboration with the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, has produced national and district level flood and drought hazard maps. At national level, the flood hazard maps were produced based on rainfall data and topography. Places with a high proportion of paved or otherwise impermeable areas, as well as inadequate drainage, are more likely to be flooded than those with large areas of pervious soils. So urbanization tends to increase the proportion of impervious areas and thus the likelihood of flooding, especially when urbanization is unplanned and there are inadequate or non-existent drainage systems. In Ghana, the problems are often compounded by poor waste management practices, leading to the few drains being choked by waste. Activities that lead to flooding from rainfall in Ghana have been well studied by many authors, and they include poor land use planning and control, encroachment on waterways and floodplains, undersized drains, debris and silt in drains, and buildings in waterways. NADMO, with the assistance of the UNDP, has also produced flood vulnerability maps, which considered population and land use. The maps were for the current situation at the time and the projected risk. More detailed district-level maps were produced in pilot areas, and data on soil, rainfall, elevation, slope, and flow accumulation areas were employed. A weighting was applied to these factors, and it was informed by literature and expert input from NADMO. The accuracy of the maps was tested in stakeholder workshops.